Good morning, everybody. We are starting a new class on Romans today, and Zach and I will be teaching. Zach's out of town today, so I got picked to do the introduction, which is good because I think that the introduction is important. So Romans is a letter that Paul wrote to the church in the city of Rome. And I want you to think for a minute about what some of the difficulties might be about studying a 2,000-year-old letter and getting a correct interpretation and teaching from it. What are some problems with getting a 2,000-year-old letter and getting accurate information? This is where you all... Language, customs. You don't really have the full context, do you? Because what do you have when you have one person's letter to somebody? You have one side of a conversation, right? Of a two-part conversation. And you don't have anything that's, whether they wrote him first, which we don't know about, or whether they wrote him back or not, we don't know about. But you've got Paul writing this letter to them, and no response whatsoever. You have no idea what's going on the other side. So you don't know if there was something specific that they wanted addressed or not. There's just a lot of things with that. We don't really know what the motivation was. We can guess. We can infer a lot of things. We don't have the full context because we don't know what was going on where Paul was. We don't know exactly what was going on in Rome. We just know that we have general information that has come down to us over 2,000 years. And so we're trying to put all this together as we study this letter. So studying a letter versus studying, if I were to sit down and write a term paper or just a document, you could say, well, this is what he had to say about this. But if I'm writing you a letter, there's a lot of things that can be read into that, pun, quote, the pun not intended there. But there's a lot of things you can put into a letter or see in a letter that may or may not have been there, and a lot of things you can miss from a letter. So there's some challenges here, but it gives us if we get more context, then we have a better understanding. Right? So the more that we can find out about the background, what was going on, who the people were it was written to, who the person was that wrote it, when we get more of that, then we have a better understanding of what he's trying to say. So I think the introduction is important. Let's see, you have the iPad, don't you?
Yes.
Okay, so you're doing my slides. Great. All right. So the more we can know, the better. Most letters that day had a general form, and for those of you my age or older, I know that when you were in school, you were taught how to write a letter by a form, were you not? There was the greetings and the body, and then you closed it by saying sincerely this, and then putting your name. And so we had a form that we were told when you write somebody a letter, you put the date up here, and then you put dear so-and-so, and you do the whole thing in order, and you have your paragraphs, and you do all this, and that's the way you're supposed to write a letter. I don't think anybody does that anymore, and nobody online does. They had a form that they followed for personal letters that was very uniform all across the Roman world at that time. So you would start with a greeting, dear so-and-so, talk to who you're talking to. Then you go to a prayer for the health of the person you're writing to. I hope that all is going well. I'm praying that everything is going well, that you are doing well, that you're healthy, all those things. Then you would either write, depending on your religion, thanks to God or thanks to the gods, if you were worshiping somebody else, for different things, and give thanks to whoever you're worshiping. And then you would go into the special contents, the details, what we would call the body. This is what's going on in my life. This is, how's things going on your end. This, I did this today, I did this. That's your special contents, details. And then you end with salutations, personal greetings. So you say, by the way, say hi to your mom and them, right? And say hi to these people. Make sure you tell these people hi. Think about these people for me. Let these people know I'm thinking about them. That's how you write a letter. When you look at all the letters Paul wrote, he followed this form very well. So it's just so the form is there. So when you see this seven verses at the beginning, It's just him setting the form, following the form, setting up the letter for what he's writing to. Okay, so now we have the immediate situation that's going on, what is going on in Rome, and what is going on where Paul is. And when Paul wrote all of his other letters, there was something going on, wasn't there? When he wrote 1 Corinthians, what was going on in Corinth? They had some messed up stuff, didn't they? There was a lot of division, which is what he started with. I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, why are you saying I'm of this guy and that guy? You should be of Jesus. Nobody else matters. And then there was a matter of church discipline because this guy was living with his father's wife. You need to handle this, not allow it to go on. You need to handle it in love, but you need to do this. So 1 Corinthians, that's the first half of the book right there, those two things. 2 Corinthians, he comes back and says, okay, apparently the division is over. You handled the discipline. The guy repented. Welcome him back with love. Do this, but then there's some other issues going on. People are questioning my apostleship, and they're writing bad things about me and saying bad things about me behind my back. I'm handling this. Galatians is kind of like Romans. Here's what's going on, because you got people coming in and teaching false doctrine. So in almost all of Paul's letters, there's something going on, and he's writing to handle a situation. Romans is pretty much the only one that he's not doing that with. And also, if you look at his letters, he doesn't appear to have any thought about this becoming scripture and us reading this and taking this as doctrine 2,000 years later. That's not even on his mind, as near as you can tell. Here's the deal, handle it. Paul's a very high D personality, right? So boom, boom. Here's what it is. Fix it. Let's move on. And so that's what he's doing. He's fix it. And he's and don't forget, people are going to be reading this 2,000 years later, and they're going to want to know how it would. No, he didn't do any of that, did he? So he has no real apparent thought that that's what's going to happen with this. All right. So the next one, Paul. Larry likes to make fun of Paul because Paul's, and apparently not the only one. Paul's sentences can be really long, can't they? Like 10, 15 verses long sometimes. The grammar gets all messed up. Paul was highly educated. Paul knew how to do grammar. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was trained from the time he was young. He was educated under Gamaliel. He knew how to write and how to speak. But he gets going here, right? Paul didn't write his own letters. And he wasn't the only one. This is a pretty common practice. He dictated it to somebody. We actually have the name of a guy named Tertius that was writing Romans. And so picture Paul with these thoughts in his mind. And Paul's a very passionate person, right? And he's fired up about whatever's going on. And so you see the picture, right? Paul's sitting here. I'm going to walk off camera for a second. Paul is just walking up and down because he's got too much energy, and he's in this room, and they need to do this, 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 and they need to do this. Oh, and by the way, this. Oh, and here's a little parenthetical thing, but he doesn't say that. He just, by the way, and here's Tertius. Just trying to get all this down, and then maybe used shorthand and came back and wrote it out. We don't know exactly what he did, but here's somebody trying to write down what Paul is just hammering out loud while he's walking around thinking, and the thoughts are in his head. And so the grammar kind of tends to get messed up because Paul's not worried about grammar, he's worried about getting his point across. So that kind of helps you understand how things can go that way, right? Obviously very passionate. Okay, so Romans, very different in the atmosphere and method, yeah.
Chris, you have to think that if he's saying stuff so rapidly, just imagine what he put out there that didn't get written down. That was just as good, just as viable as what we have.
When you're talking that fast, you can't write that fast. And so, something may have gotten left out, or he had other thoughts and said, don't write that one down. But he was just at it, right? 90 miles an hour. So Romans has a very different tone, method. This is the only letter to a church that Paul wrote that he had no part in the founding of it. So Paul had not even been to Rome, let alone help set the church up. So he had very little contact. He didn't have a lot of friends there. few details of, there are few details of any practical problems going on because he wasn't there. He wasn't getting letters from them about, hey, we've got this going on. So he really didn't know any problems that they had. That is what we can picture from this, right? Because he's not getting any mail from them, then he doesn't know that what specific problems there are. So no details. Romans, though, is the closest thing that we have, next slide please, to there we are, being a theological treatise where somebody actually just sits down and writes, this is what the gospel is about, and in the systematic way. So this is how we go through the process of things. It's the closest thing that we have in the New Testament to that, and it doesn't get there really clearly, does it? It's not just 1, 2, 3, point A, subpoint 1, 2, 3. There is nothing like that for us in Scripture, and there's probably a reason for that. But it is the closest thing that we have to that. He's writing to the church in Rome because Rome is the greatest city in the known world. And Paul has long wanted to go there, we know that, because he tells us that. What are some of the circumstances at the time? We are somewhere around AD 58. Different people place the writing of this between 56 and 58. Most people were thinking late 57, early 58. Paul is living in Achaia, probably in Corinth. We know that this took place after the events of Acts chapter 19 and before the events of Acts chapter 20 and 21. I thought that was pretty interesting that we can lock down the time period there. There's a 3-month time period where he's living in Corinth, in Achaia. That's like saying we're living in Charleston, in South Carolina. And he's there for 3 months. That's almost the only time he could have written this letter to Rome. So we know about when it was, where it was. So he's writing from Corinth, where he's already been, set up the church, got all these things going on. He's writing to them, but he's getting ready to travel to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the mother church. That was where everybody, that was where James was still there. And so it was kind of the headquarters, if you wanted, the hub. But it was a very poor church. Not a lot of money. So Paul, we find, we see had in 1 Corinthians 16 had organized a collection. And now he's getting ready to take it to Rome. And so in Romans chapter 15:25, he says, I'm leaving to go from Corinth now to go to Jerusalem with this offering that we've collected. So we've got all this back and forth documentation. We know that he collected it in 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 9 talks about it. And now in Romans 15, he's getting ready to leave Corinth, take that to Jerusalem. And then once he's done in Jerusalem, his next stop, as far as he's concerned, is Rome. So I'm coming through Jerusalem on my way to see you. So it's coming, right? Why did he write this letter to the Romans? Well, first off, we know that the trip from Corinth to Jerusalem, any travel in those days, was very dangerous. You read about the stuff that happened to Paul, shipwrecked, beaten, robbed, all these things, right? Well, when you're traveling on foot or by camel through all these rocky places, you watch the old westerns and they would hide out behind the rock, right? And then come out when the stagecoach came by. Well, there's a lot of that going on here. And it's kind of hard to outrun a horse or a camel if you're on foot. And so, unless you traveled in large groups, you were in danger just traveling. And now people know Paul has money that he's carrying because you can't wire it. You can't send a credit card number. So he's carrying money with him, a pretty good sum, whatever it is. And he's on the road, and we don't know how large a group he's got. This is a very dangerous trip. And then when he gets to Jerusalem, Paul's written several times about enemies that he has in all different places and all the bad things they're saying about him and trouble they're causing him. Well, he's got a lot of enemies in Jerusalem too. Now, why would Paul, the most written that we have record of apostle, biggest church thought leader we've had in this time period, why has he got so many enemies?
He's a traitor.
But there were people in, so yeah, a lot of the Jews, he was in danger for his life from the Jews because Christianity was not part of it. But there were people in the church trying to cause him trouble. Now, most of them were Jews also. So, but he had a lot of enemies that wanted to subvert everything he was doing inside the church as well as enemies outside the church. So it's a lot of trouble. So when he gets to Jerusalem, he's got trouble. So what's he doing? He's asking the people in Rome to pray for him. Because we know Paul believes in prayer, doesn't he? So he says, I want your prayers that we have safe travel so I can get to Jerusalem, give them this gift because they need it, and then I can come to you. So this is what's going on. And Paul's got some big plans. He wants to go to Spain. He tells us this. There's a lot of things going on in Spain. He needs a headquarters or a base. So what does Paul want to do here? He knows that if he's written to Rome, and they get his letter, that's a good thing. But what have they heard about Paul in Rome before this? He doesn't know what he's heard, right? But he knows that there are people that like him and support him and have said good things about him. And he knows there are people that don't like him and don't support him, and they've said all kinds of bad things about him. And he doesn't know what the people in Rome have heard. So what he needs to do now is he needs to kind of get the record straight. Am I skipping something? I am. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we know he wants to go to Spain. Why Spain? In the 1st century AD, what's going on in Spain? Y'all don't know your history, neither did I. There's a lot of things that are affecting everything about Roman culture that are going on in Spain. Lucan is a very famous poet. Columella and Pomponius Mela are great figures of Roman literature writers. Quintilian is the master of Roman oratory. He's in Spain. And then Seneca, you all heard the name Seneca, right? Greatest of the Roman Stoic philosophers. He was actually the tutor for Emperor Nero. All these people and several others are in Spain, writing, doing their things, and influencing all of Roman culture. So there's a lot of cultural change going on that's the core of those changes are coming from Spain. So if you're wanting to influence the known world with something, Spain's a good place to go. So Paul wants to go to Spain. Next slide. Rome would be ideal because it's a large city with a lot of money and easy access to get to Spain, as easy as it gets. But he needs the church in Rome to be sympathetic with him because he doesn't know what they've heard about him, but he knows what he wants them to know about him. So he wants to set the record straight and say, this is what I believe, this is who I am. It's on record right here. You read it, you will know me, and therefore you can decide whether I'm good to work with or not before I get there. So then he gets to Rome eventually, but he never does get to Spain. All right, so the layout of the book, so that's everything leading up to Romans, the book, the letter. So why did he write it? He needs a base. He wants their support. And so he's writing ahead of time so when he gets there, they can say, yeah, we're good with this or not, and he will know whether he needs to, we're going to work with this or if he needs to go to plan B or what. And so that's the whole thing going on. Now the book itself has a general outline. Chapter 1 through 8 are the problem of righteousness. Righteousness in Paul's definition is just meaning that you have a right relationship with God. Chapter 9 through 11, problem of the Jews. The Jews were God's chosen people, but they had rejected Jesus, and they had some messed up beliefs, and they were causing some Jews were causing a lot of problems in the Christian church at the time. There were a lot of devout Jews that were leaders, but some Jews were causing a lot of problems, as we see throughout all the other letters, right? So 12 through 15, practical questions about life and living, and then you get this introduction for Phoebe and personal greetings in chapter 16. All right, so chapter 1, we're diving in, and we're going to get through chapter 1 and part of chapter 2 today, Dale. Dale's skeptical. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And we haven't finished the sentence yet. Through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles in behalf of his name, among whom you also are the called of Jesus Christ. To all who are beloved of God in Rome, called as saints, grace to you, peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So almost that whole thing is a sentence, isn't it? Long sentence. So who does Paul say he is? He's giving his credentials now as to why should you listen to me? Well, when most of us offer our credentials, you get somebody that's invited to speak somewhere. He wrote this book. He's spoken to this many people. He's done this much research. Paul's first credential, I'm a slave. A little bit different, right? I'm a slave owned by Jesus Christ. What do you think he means by that?
He was his servant.
A servant? Why does Paul set himself up as a slave of Jesus Christ? More even than a servant.
He does what he asks him to do.
Does what he asked?
Or
Okay.
told.
Okay.
He's not going to put himself in a position that what I'm going to tell you is coming from me, it's coming from God.
Okay. So what I'm telling you is not from me, it's from my master, Jesus. Okay. Y'all familiar with this is kind of an older cultural thing, the Far East does things. If I save your life, what do you do in response?
You're indebted to that.
You're indebted to me for the rest of your life, right? So this would be where he saved my life, therefore my life belongs to him because he saved it. It's no longer mine, it's his. Well, if that's the case, then I am a slave owned by the one who saved me. Does that make sense? We don't hear that kind of cultural talk very often anymore, do we? But it was pretty common here. And it's, the Far East cultures and, different older cultures, honor cultures, that's not that uncommon of a thing. So Jesus had loved Paul and had died for Paul, and then shook Paul up on the on the road and said, "This is me," And so when Paul gets that message, then he says, "Oh, there's nothing I can do but give you everything I've got." Now, the word doulos for slave has a second meaning. In the Old Testament, it is used to describe great men of God. We have Moses and Joshua describes Moses as doulos, a slave. Joshua is described as a slave. In Amos and Jeremiah, we have different prophets described as slaves. These are all great men of God, well-known, influential, but they are also called doulos, slaves. So Paul could be setting himself up as, okay, I'm owned by Christ, but I'm also coming in as a prophet almost to tell you some things that you need to know, and because of this part of the meaning, you need to listen to me. Again, this is a letter. He's not real clear. We're just putting out some possibilities here. So Paul says, I'm called. I'm an apostle. The word apostle just means someone who is sent. That's why we talk about the 12 apostles and Paul as the last apostle, but apostle is used other times in the New Testament to mean other people because they were sent. They were someone that had been given a specific task by God. Next thing, set apart by God. Paul says, before I was born, God had set me apart for this work. You think Paul's the only one that God has set apart for a work? Does God have something specific in mind for each one of us? If he would just tell us what it was. Right? I mean, you can sit here and pray and ask, find good, wise counsel. And we've done that and made some boneheaded decisions. Thought we had good counsel. Prayed about it. That was a dumb decision because we didn't wait on things. Sometimes he will make it clear if you wait long enough. Sometimes he kind of lets you work at it because he's got something, what he's got specific may not matter as far as what you eat for lunch today may not be anything in line with what he's got specifically. But it might be because you might run into somebody at lunch today. So anyway, but Paul says, I was set apart before I was ever born. And then I received two things from God. One is grace and one is a task. Now, why is grace important to somebody like Paul?
He'd been killing Christians.
Pardon?
He had been killing
He
Christians.
had been killing Christians, so he was guilty of murder. What else? What did Paul grow up learning he should do? Follow the law, earn your salvation by doing all these good works. And killing Christians was a good work. So I'm earning favor with men and with God by doing all these things, checking off my list. And then Jesus says, no, there's this thing called grace, which you can't earn at all, and it does more good than all those things you ever checked off of your list. So Paul, as a Pharisee of the Pharisees, hardcore Jew, learned from the time he was young, you do everything to earn your salvation. You do everything to earn your favor with God. All of a sudden he gets this message of grace, where you cannot earn it, but God will give it to you. Now, who is going to respond? Who could respond better to that than Paul? Who could be more in awe of grace than a murderer? So Paul, again, just feels like, I have to tell people this because it is so incredible. Now, back to the set-apart apostle thing, we think that the word Pharisee also means set apart, the set-apart ones. And the Pharisees thought they were set apart as a special people. So much so that if they were walking in the crowd with you, your robe, you can't touch their robe. Because that would mess everything up. Because I'm set apart, you can't even touch my robe, let alone me. Because I'm a Pharisee. Paul was Pharisee of the Pharisees, right? Where'd my notes go? And then, not only that, but they were so racist that they, and I've said this before in class, but they referred to Gentiles, non-Jews, as being God's fuel for the fires of hell. There was no possibility of a Gentile ever being saved, as far as they were concerned. They were fuel for the fires of hell. This is the culture Paul came out of, who hates Gentiles, who thinks they're fuel for the fires of hell, and now he is the apostle to who? The Gentiles. So you get the paradox, right? This is just so cool that God works this way. The guy that thought you had to earn everything now realizes the only way you get anything is by grace. The guy who hated Gentiles is now the one I'm sending as the apostle to the Gentiles to teach them everything there is, including this grace. So it's really cool the way God's working these things out. Okay, next we have just a two-part outline of the gospel. We have incarnation and resurrection. Now, that boils it down pretty good, doesn't it? God became flesh, was incarnated on earth to live among men, to prove that he understands all of our weaknesses, all of our thoughts, to have sympathy for us, to be tempted in all ways like we are, lived with us, showed us that it could be done, showed us a perfect example of life, and submission to the Father. So that's God incarnate. He became flesh, lived with us, and was perfect. And then was killed, and by the power of God was raised from the dead to prove that he is God, raised from the dead. If you get those two things, you've got most of the gospel, don't you? So a very simple form of it, but that's what he's got here. Now, we could do a quarter on this, couldn't we? So understand, when we're doing the entire book of Romans in one quarter, we're rushing. But we're going to do it. So anyway, there we go. All right, next. he's still following the form of the letter, right? So first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of the Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers, requesting if perhaps now, at last by the will of God, I will succeed in coming to you, for I long to see you, so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that often I have planned to come to you, and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, just as among the rest of the Gentiles. I'm under obligation both to the Greeks and to the uncultured, both to the wise and to the foolish. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. So, if you're trying to get somebody on your side, what do? You start with a compliment, right? Is he being fake? No. People know fake compliments, and people know real compliments. But if you start with a compliment, it helps soften things up, right? And then he gives, we see some insight into his prayer life. I make mention to you always in my prayers. I've been praying for you every day, even though I've never met you. I pray for you every day, and I'm asking you to pray for me as I go on this journey, because I believe that prayer is very effective and very powerful. So I'm praying for you, even though I haven't met you, and I'm asking you to pray for me. Also, Paul, and we give Paul a rough time about being arrogant, which he comes across as, but he's got a lot of humility too, doesn't he? Because he says, I want to receive from you as well as be able to give to you. So when I get to you, I'm not going to come in as the know-it-all that can teach you everything and you guys just need to listen to everything I say. I'm coming to you because I want to get some fruit. I want to help convert some people. I want to give you spiritual gifts, but I also want to learn from and receive gifts of spiritual nature from you. So we can do this two-way street because I respect you. And so he's got some humility here. And then we see that the gospel is for everyone, right? The Jew, or the Greek, the barbarian, this one said uncultured. When they say Greek, they are talking about pretty much everybody in the Roman Empire, because the Greek Empire before the Romans had pretty much carried the Greek language, and the Greek language was more common in Roman territory than the Roman language was. So the Greeks and the barbarians, the cultured, the uncultured, the gospel is for everybody. There is nobody that it is not for. Okay. Next, Romans 1, 16 to 17. So we're moving on into the form of the letter. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous one will live by faith. So now he's got his introduction done, right? He's got all the formal greetings done. He's got all this done. And now let's get started. Let's not beat around the bush. Here we go. The warm-up's over. I'm proud of the gospel. Now, Paul is telling them, I'm proud of the gospel. What's happened to Paul up to this point? He's been imprisoned in Philippi. He's been chased out of Thessalonica. They had to smuggle him out of Berea. Yeah. We know that more stuff happens to him afterward, and then late in Acts we get I think it was Acts, where we get the whole gamut of everything that's happened to Paul. Shipwrecked and this and that and the other, and 3 days at sea, probably holding onto a log, all this stuff. And Paul says, I am proud of the gospel. And then we have three watchwords here that Paul uses a lot: salvation, and faith, and justification. And there's a day's worth of stuff right there on each one. What does salvation mean? Salvation, according to Paul and New Testament writers, could be salvation just from being lost. You're on the wrong road. Matthew 18:11 talks about that. If you're going the wrong direction, you're lost, right? Salvation means give you a map, show you how to turn around or make a detour and get back on the right track. Salvation from sin, Matthew 1:21, Jesus came to save us from sin. It's like being somebody who's sick. You don't have to go to the doctor. You know what's wrong with you. You know you got COVID. You know it's the flu. You know whatever it is, right? You know what is wrong. You have no medication. You have no way to help yourself. Somebody comes along and says, "Oh, here's a little penicillin," or whatever the drug is now, right? That's salvation. Because you had no remedy. Overall, salvation is anything from the wrath of God, Romans 5:9 and Hebrews chapter 10:31. Without Jesus, what do we have? We have nothing but judgment. With Jesus, we have no judgment. We have all that washed away, right? Faith has many different definitions you can go to. The simplest one is loyalty or fidelity. If you are a married couple, you expect your spouse to have fidelity, right? That means not cheat on you. How much faith does that involve? This is the lowest level. You know, it doesn't mean that I have to love you. It just means that I don't cheat on you. You know, the Marines, always faithful, right? But there's more to it than that. In the letter to the Thessalonians, Paul said, I want to find out if you're being faithful through this test. If you're just standing strong and holding on. Another one, though, is belief. 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, your faith is in vain. So it's a conviction that something is true. It can be part of the Christian set of beliefs. We talk about somebody being loyal to the faith. You know, you are loyal to the teachings or the doctrine that Jesus has set forth. When you put it all together, faith is a total acceptance and absolute trust. Does that make sense? Okay. Total acceptance and absolute trust in whatever it is you're putting your faith in. Justification. What does David Clayton always say about justification? Just as if I had never sinned. And that's about as good as it can be. When you are being judged, it's for the things you have done, correct? And any of us that are going to be judged on the things we've done, we're not going to come out innocent. God treats us through justification as if we had never even been a sinner. When we are justified with Him, He looks at us as if we had never been a sinner. He sees no sin because He sees Jesus. We have a new relationship with God. So instead of coming to God as somebody that we have to fear all the time, He's like Grandpa, right? You know, in a way. This is human terms. But He's somebody we love, we have confidence in, we have a friendship with. We know Grandpa's not going to spank us. Dad might, you know. Grandpa's not. Grandpa's going to spoil us. He's going to hug on us. We can come cry in His arms. We go to a God who radiates forgiving and redeeming love, and we have that right relationship. Right relationship was the definition for righteousness, right? We have that right relationship only because of what God has done for us. It has nothing to do with anything we've done. And again, coming from Paul, that's pretty cool. Okay, the next set of verses. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, that is, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasonings, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible mankind. Of birds, four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them up to vile impurity in the lust of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood, and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. That's a long sentence, right? Pardon? Oh!
2 more.
Pardon. Okay. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For the women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature. And likewise the men too abandoned natural relations with women, and burned their desire toward one another, males with males, committing shameful acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. That is a depressing set of verses. I'll bet y'all, when I'm reading, when I get to the last couple chapters of the Gospels, the trial and the death, the crucifixion, it's like, I don't even want to read it anymore. I don't want to read about those people. But guess what? Paul said in another place, so were you. You used to be that. So what are we talking about here? The wrath of God. Now, Paul only mentions the wrath of God 3 times. Now, he speaks about wrath quite often. He never mentions God being angry. So how can God have wrath and not be angry? Interesting, right? I think we get our definition of wrath mixed up with Paul's definition of wrath. And so I'm going to float this and see what you think. There are laws in place. One, for instance, is called gravity, right? If you walk off a cliff, what happens with the law of gravity? It's enforced. It proves itself right every time, right? You can say, well, I don't like gravity. I'm going to ignore gravity. Step off the cliff. The law is still in place, whether you like it or not. Whether you believe in it or not, the law is still there. God has set certain moral laws in place. And one is, it's obvious from looking at nature that there's a creator. Even though I didn't speak to anybody but the Jews as God, it's obvious there is a creator. You cannot look at the function of this universe and not realize it's been created. There are too many laws in place, and when you violate those laws, what happens? You suffer consequences. You step off the cliff, you suffer the consequences. Nobody had to be angry at you. You just broke a law. If you break God's moral laws, sooner or later, there are going to be consequences. When you are in defiance, sooner or later, there are going to be consequences. So so when you violate them, there's a price to pay. It's about pay. So the wrath of God is about paying that price. It's not necessarily about God being angry with you. You just broke the law. And what does he say about ignorance? What did your parents say when you did something? I didn't know. Ignorance is no excuse, right? Because there's been enough evidence from the beginning of time for you to know something. You may not have had the entire law, the book of the law, but you should have known something was in place here, right? So Tertullian was an early church father who wrote that the vast majority of mankind know the God of Moses, whether or not they've ever heard of Moses. They know the God of Moses because there is, so 1st or 2nd century AD, probably 2nd century Tertullian, there is so much evidence of God that whether you know about his name Jehovah, how he worked with the Jews or not, there's evidence of God. So what are the results of not accepting God? Well, they considered themselves wise. They went to adultery, idolatry, not adultery. Adultery was given, right? Idolatry, which is where you put anything in place of you and God, in between you and God. Anything that's more important than God in your life is a form of idolatry. Epithumia is a word here, a Greek word used here, the desire for forbidden pleasure to the extent that a man will do nameless and shameless things because they have become overwhelmed. In James chapter 1, he talks about we're tempted when we see something and then we dwell on it, right? And then we're carried away and we're enticed by our lust, and then our lust gives birth to sin, and sin comes to death. So when you first see a temptation, it might not bug you, or it might bug you a little bit. When you dwell on it, have you ever known somebody that just went off the deep end and did some things so crazy, you're like, I can't understand how this person with this background and this knowledge and this life behind him did that. You know, you run off with a 20-year-old secretary after being married for 30 years, or whatever. You know, that's an old stereotype thing. But just stupid things like that, right? You know, what about Murdoch and the drugs and all the stuff he's done? You know, the lawyer out here. He knew better, but it got to the point, you can tell his mind got to the point where it was so overwhelmed with the evil in it that he couldn't think straight. That's where these people have gotten to. And what is it? All that list of sins, right? Is there anything in there we don't know about? What did Solomon say? Nothing new under the sun, right? All that stuff was going on in that culture, and everybody in Rome knew it, and Paul knew it. They were aware of everything that was going on, and all of it was, and it was in their culture then. We say, man, I can't believe it's so bad today. And we're going, the whole thing's going downhill. Well, it may be, but it was 2,000 years ago too. And there's nothing new. Chapter 2. Therefore you have no excuse, you foolish person, every one of you who passes judgment, for in that matter in which you judge someone else, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, you foolish person who passes judgment on those who practice such things and yet does them as well, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and restraint and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will repay each person according to his deeds. To those who by perseverance in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But to those who are self-serving and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, he will give wrath and indignation. There will be tribulation and distress for every soul of mankind who does evil, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek, but glory, honor, and peace to everyone who does what is good, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. So, he's writing this part. I'm going to finish. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. I'm going to stop there for now. So Paul is writing this section of verses to Jews. So we know that Jews have been, because the Jews, many of them, claimed open exemption from the judgment of God. I'm one of God's chosen people. He's not. I won't go to hell. He's not going to judge me. They were, because I'm chosen. He won't do that. I can do whatever I want. Kind of like the Gnosticism that we talked about a few months ago. So the mercy of God, according to the Jews, was an invitation to sin rather than an incentive to repent. Now, do you remember Paul saying, shall we continue in sin so grace will abound? May it never be. A little more context here, right? Because there were people that believed, yeah, we'll just sin more because there'll be more grace. I can do whatever I want. Paul says God will judge everyone, and there's no reason to consider yourself above anyone else. And then we get to thoughts about, faith and works, because we have this too today, don't we? Show me, people say, well, I have faith. I don't have to go out and do all these things. Well, Paul says faith and works are intertwined, and so does James in chapter 2. You can't have one without the other. James says, show me your faith without your works. I'll show you my faith by my works. Faith without works is dead. Paul says it's the ones who are going to be found faithful are not the ones who heard the law, but the ones who do it. So get off your tail and do something. And we have, the judgment. This is kind of some interesting verses, the last couple verses here. On what basis is God going to judge people? We've got some thoughts about that, don't we? And we probably all asked the question, well, what about the people in the Old Testament that weren't Jews, that never knew God, or people today that never knew God, because we didn't take the gospel to every creature. So there are some people that we know have died without ever hearing about Jesus. How does God judge them? I'm open.
But you have a law unto yourself. In other words, people that didn't know God said, well, if they do right and they act correctly based on their conscience, then that becomes their own law.
Okay. So God says, there's evidence that I exist. There's evidence that there are laws in place. If you don't know Jesus, I'm going to judge you by what you do know, or by what you should know. And don't come up and say, I can't believe you said that. This is my theory, and I'm not going to tell you this is absolutely right. God says if you never heard about Jesus, then it wouldn't be fair for me to judge you based on Jesus. Does that make sense? But I will judge you based on what you should know. And you should know that there is a creator. And you should know that there are moral laws in place. I will judge you on those. If you know more than that, I'm going to judge you based on what you know. I've never been taught that I can remember. And growing up, I was told, well, they should have known. Ignorance is no excuse. Well, loving God, fair God, think about it. But what does that put on us? It puts on us the responsibility of making sure people know. Because if you don't know about Jesus, and God judges you based on what you do know, you can only be rewarded so far. The more you know and the more you've given your life to Jesus, the more reward you can have. So we want people to have more reward. That puts the responsibility back on us to make sure that they understand. Thoughts?
I was trying to remember the verse that talks about, I look at your heart, something about, I wish I could remember, I'm struggling trying to remember what that is.
There's at least one that says God knows the innermost thoughts. Back up a little bit when we talk about how evil these people were. It made me think of the verse, I didn't go look it up, that says there will come times when people say, we'll praise people for being good for the evil they're doing, and condemn people as bad for the good they're doing. And I look around and I say, huh. All right, well, we are past time. Thank you all. Zach will be up next week. Take over there.